Hi folks, in this video I'm going to be looking at how to paint the bases for Skabbik's Plaguepack for Warhammer Underworlds. And this is a lovely grimy cobblestone sewer base which will be perfect for loads of different fantasy games. So let's cue the music. To start out with, I'm coming in with a base coat of Petroleum Grey from scale 75 all over the raised areas on this sculpted sewer base. I'm doing this over a black primer and I'm leaving the black showing through in the recesses as a shadow and looking to use this to basically paint all of the raised areas, all of these cobblestones, flagstones. And at this point in time, we're not particularly worried about directional lighting or anything like that, but I am making sure that the paint is nice and thin and running off my brush, because I'm going to be looking at doing this in 2 to 3 thin coats to make sure that I don't obscure any details and any of the bibbly-bobbly bits that are cast into the cobblestones on this base. And this colour is a really nice dark brown grey, and I haven't really found an equivalent for it in the Games Workshop line. And the Scale 75 paints can take a little bit of use to if you're not used to them, but I really do like this as a dark grey that you're going to do some more earthy tones and some more natural tones over the top of it, rather than going for a clean sort of industrial grey finish. In this lighting it almost looks as if it's a brown colour, but it is a grey on the tonal hue. It's just a very warm dark grey. This is what our cobbles look like now that base coat has dried. First highlight, I'm coming in with a 50-50 mix of Petroleum Grey and Graphene Grey from scale 75. And I have picked a light direction, which is coming from the left hand side of this base, and with this quite thin paint I'm moving in a right to left motion with this paint to cover about 3/4 of each stone. And with the suggested direction of the light and the direction I'm moving my brush will mean that the most pigment is left behind at the end of the stroke. And in doing this, we are starting to build up a nice transition within our first highlight and our deeper shadows on this murky, grimy sewer base. Just like the first step, we are looking to do this in a couple of thin layers, and if you think you've got too stark a line, you can always come back in with your base colour and soften out the transition with a very thin paint moving backwards and forwards in a feathering motion. But as this is just the base and where the miniature is going to be stood upon, I wouldn't panic too much exactly about each of the specific soft edges, as this will all look very seamless once it's all together. And here is our base once a couple of passes of that mixture has been applied. Next highlight, I'll be coming in with Graphene Grey from scale 75. And this is very similar to Mechanica Standard Grey from Games Workshop, but it's a little different in its tonal variety. And with this, I'm painting a thin layer over the left half of the brick, but also making a point to pick out the top edge and the bottom edge as well. And with this, we are just starting to define some of our light shapes onto these bricks. And as you can see, this is a lot colder in tone than our previous step. And this is really allowing us to start to define and have those shapes pop. We're still not picking out any of the ridges or sculpted detail within these bricks. We're letting the wet paint that's quite loose and flowing off our brush do that for us. We're doing a more individual lighting direction on these bricks rather than doing a layering of each individual ridge at this time. It's going to still look very nice with doing it this way, and it saves you a lot of time trying to pick out individual cobble bricks. And I'm making a point to pick up the vertical sides of this bit of stone that's sticking up at the side of the sewer grate. But just like in the previous steps, it's about taking your time, having thinned paint down to a very thin layer consistency, and picking out that left hand side of the brick and picking out the top and that bottom edge to show some light reflexes with light coming in from different angles, but with the bulk of the light coming in from that directional source. If you prefer to have your light coming from the right rather than the left, then you can just swap this round and do it in reverse, so you'd have paint that right hand side rather than the left hand side like I've been doing. And here we can see the cobblestones after a second pass of the graphene grey has been applied. For the next highlight, I've added some rainy grey from scale 75 into the graphene grey. Now this is not an exact mix, I think it's something like 1 part rainy grey to 2 parts graphene grey, but your mileage may vary on the exact tonal amount that you'd like to do. Just like in the previous step, we're going to be focusing on a left hand side directional lighting. And as you can see, I've kept it quite thin here, and I'm looking at picking up that top edge, about 25% of that left hand side of the stone, picking out a bottom edge and then the right hand edge with a thin edge highlight. And as you can really see, this is quite thin, and on the larger stones it's a much more subtle transition than it is on that top stone at the top. And that's what we want to do with this. With these cobblestones, we don't want to apply this in an area where it's going to have such a stark difference. This is quite a bit lighter in the colour variation, and we want to make sure that the wet paint is picking up those raised areas and allowing us to define some shapes and pop contrast on these rather simple rectangular shapes on the base. And it's just a matter of going around, taking your time, and I'm using a sort of sketching motion with the side of my brush to ensure those raised areas are picked up as well as a priority, and leaving some of that more darker shades that we've done previously in a more of our recessed areas. And the reason we're keeping this thin is that it will go on looking quite bright, but will dry much darker than it's going on. And with that in mind, we can come back and do further passes as we need to get the colour consistency that we'd like. For the next highlight, I'll be adding some Thar brown from scale 75 into the mixture, so this is about a 50-50 ratio. So it's 50-50 of our previous mix and 50% of the Thar brown. As you can see, this is quite a light highlight, and it's the final highlight that we'll be doing on the grey. And with this, I'm doing a zenithal edge highlighting, so I'm picking the upper edges and the directional edges where the light is going to be hitting the strongest. With it also quite thin on my brush, I'm also going to do some scratching motions over some of the more raised areas on the cobblestones to ensure that some of the texture is still kept and picked up at the extreme levels of the highlighting. And I switched to a much thinner brush to do this from the previous steps to ensure there gets to be lots of controls when doing some of these more smaller cobblestones around the edge of the sewer grate. And don't let the conformity of the painting culture tell you that where exactly to put the highlights on this. Just do what you feel is right, do as large or as little as you want with this. The smaller you do, the more subtle that highlight pop is going to be, and the more natural and seamless this is going to be look. But if you want to do something that stands out a lot more, then you can cover a much larger area with this scratchy, thinned, very light grey highlight. And the reason that we added the Thar brown into this is that it just gives us that little bit of extra warmth into our quite cold grey tones to allow us to have that grimy feel in the sewers. And this is what it looks like when all of our highlights have been applied onto all of the cobbles. To apply some patches of moss and algae to the cobblestones, I have taken some well shaken dirty down effects and moss, and with a very wet brush to ensure that it's thinned down just a little, I'm tapping bits of this product onto the cobblestones. I'm trying to focus into the darker areas of the stone so as not to ruin all the time we have spent highlighting. And I found with stuff like this that it's very easy to go overboard very quickly. So make sure that it's thinned down a little and that you are sparing to begin with. And I would recommend focusing into the shadow side of the stone, so as well as being patchy, you do get a stylized finish to the moss. And if you really want the moss and algae effects to be really popping against the stones, once it's dry, you may want to come back with a second coat, and as you can see here, it's allowing for a much more vivid saturation of green, given the impression that this has been growing here for a long time and has started to really start to sprout. The dirty down moss effect does tend to dry quite matte, and I really do like that finish, and it really does complement the matte effect finish of the Scale 75 paints. With the stone part of our sewer base now complete, we can now focus onto the sewer grate itself. And I'm going for a bronze copper look for my sewer grate. And to start out with a base coat, I'll be using Decayed metal from Scale 75. And there's nothing unusual about this base coat here, it's just thinned with a little bit of water to ensure that it flows nicely off the brush. And I'm going to be painting in, being as careful as possible, all over this sewer grate area. If you make any mistakes, don't worry, wait for it to dry, and then neaten up with your petroleum grey as a nice shadow area to hide any mistakes made. For the first highlight, I'll be coming in with old copper from Scale 75. And I'm using the Scale 75 metallics purely for their very fine particulates and the fact that they do tend to almost self-blend very nicely. And I'm going to go with this across a couple of passes, but I've kept this thin on the brush and making sure my brush is wet to ensure that it flows smoothly, and be focusing on areas where the light is going to be hitting the strongest. So we have this stone at the top right of that sewer grate. I'm going to be making sure that the area just below that is going to be cast in shadow, and we can pick out one to the bottom and to the left side of the sewer grate as a much stronger colour. And I've turned here to make sure that I have better access and better understanding of how the highlight is to be applied. To ensure that the sewer grate really pops, especially as there's going to be a miniature covering most of it, I'm coming in with some amber alchemy from Scale 75. Now this colour is almost a metallic normal colour. It's rather than being focused as a pure metallic, it's almost like this is a yellowy orange colour with some level of metallic to it. I'm using this to do an edge highlight on the sides of the slats in the sewer grate, focusing towards the bottom and to the left, and to paint a little bit onto the flatter surfaces to show that directional light source, mainly to leave that upper surface in shadow. And you can do as much or as little as you want on the edge rim. As you can see, I'm coming back in with that previous colour to soften out and take back any areas that I think I might have touched up too much with this colour. If you do too much of this amber alchemy, this sewer grate will start looking very yellow, and having that previous colour on the palette to touch up areas will allow you to keep it still feeling grimy whilst maintaining some bright copper flashes on this sewer grate. For the last step, I'm coming in with a black paint that I've thinned down to a very thin consistency, almost a wash consistency. And with this, I'm going to be redefining any lost shadows in the sewer grate and between the cobblestones themselves. This is just a matter of doing some line work here. It's not particularly fancy, it's just running this very thin paint into the gaps on this sewer grate to give it the impression that it's much deeper than the base would suggest, and maybe doing a little bit of glazing the black onto the copper to give it a bit more of a murky feel. As you see, I've kept it thin enough there that it's washing straight into the recess on that rim. I'm then going to go around and run this thin black paint wash into all the cracks and crevices and really help define any of these stones that have been lost to that original base coat. And the reason I'm using paint rather than a wash itself is that it's going to do that double task of doing the dark illusion on the sewer grate and doing our panel line for itself. It'll also be a much more consistent finish than if I'd used a wash. I'm using Vallejo model color black, but you can use any black that you want. But using this almost very matte finish black allows me to keep with a consistency with the stones, rather than having that slight glossy nature that even a non-gloss wash will leave behind, which would end up needing some level of matte varnish to take away some shine. With your favourite black thinned down to a nice smooth consistency, paint the rim of the base to ensure that all of the raised areas that we painted at previous steps stand out nicely with a smooth finish from the rest of the base. And with that, the sewer grate for this scaling figure for Skabbik's Plaguepack is now complete. I hope this tutorial has given you some ideas on how to paint sewer grates, copper, metallics and cobblestone effects for sewer bases or city streets for any of your sci-fi or fantasy miniatures. If you like this tutorial, why not consider subscribing? It's free of charge, it helps me out, and you get future videos just like this one in your YouTube feed. So, from me and this little ratty boy here, until next time, folks.